Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the PrimateCast when we roll on with part 2 of our student selection podcast series. And in this episode, we're going to be focusing more on the research side of primatological science and in some cases even how people got into research.
That's right. So last time we heard some conservation clips, and today we're going to hear from 5 or 6 renowned primatologists about different aspects of their research.
Mm-hmm. So we're going to tackle things like, how scientific discoveries turn into, the building of research programs around those discoveries to kind of narrow down the finer points of that research. And then at the end to, putting yourself out there as a young scientist and making contacts that could be long lasting and kind of setting yourself up for a future in science.
Right. And to get to your first point there, we're going to start out with a clip that we chose to put in the show from Frans de Waal, where he's going to talk about a phenomenon that he's very interested in, empathy, and how it's, in his mind, it's kind of gone from a term that's kind of vague into more of a scientifically precise term through the research program he's put together.
Mm-hmm. And then you'll hear later on from Dr. Joseph Call, who talks about this idea of discovery to getting to the finer points of research, and then through Bill McGrew, who's going to talk about defining specific concepts within science as well, kind of similar to this idea that Frans is getting into. And finally from Dr. Dora Biro, who talks about not only her research paradigm and using the comparative approach in science, but also to how she got started. And then we're going to end with a clip from Dr. Tetsuro Matsuzawa here at the Primate Research Institute.
Right, that was the first PrimateCast.
The very first, you got to go way back in time.
Yeah.
The very first, and Dora's clip actually from her podcast is a nice segue into Professor Matsuzawa's as well, because she actually came here to work with him on the Eye Project.
Right, so he'll be talking about the Eye Project. And it'll be nice to finish our 1.5 year in review podcast with the very first podcast that we did with him.
And so here's Frans de Waal.
So initially, when I would say that even chimpanzees have empathy, people were very sort of objecting to that kind of idea. And I think it is because they had a very high opinion about empathy. I believe that Povinelli even once wrote a paper that chimpanzees have no empathy. What he meant is they have no theory of mind. And even that, of course, is under debate. But for me, empathy is not theory of mind. That's maybe an outgrowth of it, and it is related to it. But in psychology, there's a lot of resistance to it. Whereas if you go to the average person in the street and you say, does your dog have empathy? You always get an affirmative answer because the dog responds to emotions. So if you're sad, the dog will try to console you. And actually recently an experiment was published on that particular issue. And if you're happy, the dog will be happy and try to play with you. And so dogs respond to our emotions, and we recognize that as related to empathy, because that's also in young children how we see empathy. And so that kind of resistance has now subsided to a large degree, I think, because rodents have now empathy according to some people, and birds have it according to some people. And so it's not limited. I'm not just talking about chimpanzees anymore. It's a wide range of animals, and certainly mammals and birds, in which we recognize that they're sensitive to the emotions of others. And we're not necessarily claiming perspective taking or theory of mind, even though I think in some species, like elephants and apes, that becomes a big issue and a big possibility.
So where do you take it from here then?
Well, we keep doing experiments on this. And we keep doing experiments on cooperation. I think the empathy literature on animals will keep growing. The word is not really a taboo anymore, I have the impression. And so it will get bigger. And then people will... And that happens with every term that we use. If you use the term theory of mind, initially it's a black and white discussion. Does this animal have theory of mind, yes or no? And now we are at the point where the whole concept has sort of fallen apart in little pieces. And we say, yes, the scrub jays, they may have this part of it, but not that part. Or the elephants may have this part, or not that part. And humans may have all of the parts, but I'm not even sure that humans have all of the parts. But certainly not in early development. And so now the concept has more or less fallen apart. And the same thing will happen with empathy. I look at empathy as a sort of umbrella term for how one organism understands another, or relates to the situation and the feelings of another at least. But I'm sure 10 years from now we will have divided it up in little pieces, and a dog will have only some of these pieces.
Okay, so moving on to our students for today. Our first one is Lyra Yu, who's a doctoral candidate in the section on language intelligence.
I am interested in the behavior which occurs during interaction with others. Especially, I am interested in the behavior that matches in time, so-called behavioral synchrony. Like in humans, I believe this behavior synchrony would play an important role as social communication in chimpanzees, who are known as highly social non-human primates. So my PhD thesis aims at investigating the relationship between behavioral synchrony and social affiliation in chimpanzees under laboratory settings. I originally got interested in primatology when I was in undergraduate school. One invited professor introduced Primate Research Institute during his talk. Until then, I didn't know there are some places that study chimpanzees' cognition. So I thought studying non-human primate species is a very interesting scientific approach to know more about humans. I liked the PrimateCast, an interview with Dr. Joseph Call, because he uses comparative approaches between humans and non-human primates. During the interview, he said, documenting anecdotes is the first step to research further. I thought many young experimental primatologists, including me, would be encouraged by this word. And it may help us to keep challenge on recording interesting phenomena with a simple and clear method.
Yeah, so thanks, Lyra. I was really happy that some of the students kind of started with this kind of fundamental ideas in science and scientific discovery, where you always kind of have to start somewhere, but then once you have that initial realization or discovery, there's so much work that needs to come after it.
Right, and Joseph Cole especially is good at taking things that have been noticed through anecdotes and actually studying them systematically in the lab. And he's working at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig, where they have access to all 4 great ape species at the Leipzig Zoo. So it's a really exciting place to work.
And he's also expanded his research beyond primates into corvids and probably in the future more. So
that's right. Great for the comparative approach.
Yeah. Okay. So here's Joseph Call.
Of course, if you want to investigate something, the first thing you need to do is document that it exists, that it occurs. And once you have that, then you can see, what is the cognitive processes that are controlling the behavior that you're observing. But I don't think this is unique about Leipzig. I think other people use it with their questions. The thing that is perhaps what I was saying, the low resolution, yes, has to do with this. But sometimes, very often, what happens is the phenomenon is documented, and then the work stops. And that is fine as a first step, but it leaves lots of open questions. And I think, when we have found some results, say 10 years ago, at that point there were so many alternative interpretations that we had to run more studies to really know. Now, we're talking about a process that took 10 years, so you cannot expect to wait 10 years to publish the paper, right? So you present something that you think is an advance, and from there you need to keep working on it, and you also give the opportunity to your colleagues to also work on it.
Our next student, Yana Kim, is a doctoral candidate also in the section on language and intelligence.
I'm interested in prosocial behavior, and which is similar to helping behavior, and I'm especially interested in the origin. Where does it come from? So now I'm comparing orangutans and chimpanzees because their social structure or social environment is so different. So I'd like to look at whether those kind of social complexity itself is influencing the prosocial propensity in general. Ever since I was very young, I always dreamed to be a zookeeper. So I entered the university, which is famous for the animal kind of things. And then I just happened to be here. And I really like what I'm doing here. And I really like studying primates in captivity and then also in the wild. So I think I found myself happy when I study primate, and I cannot really imagine the other things. And I met this wonderful professor. His name is Willie McGrew, and I happened to listen to his podcast, which is on SciCast's website. And the section that I chose is really well describing how his perspective on primatology, and also how he really perceived how we should study primate. So I really like him. I love him. I admire him. I respect him.
So our next clip from Dr. Bill McGrew came from an interview we did with him at the IIAS conference last year. And that's also the conference where we talked to Joseph. So the focus of that was on the evolution of the human mind. And both Bill and Joseph touched on scientific methods and things like creating better operational definitions for terms, and in Joseph's case, turning anecdotes into discoveries. So we're very grateful that we had both of them at that conference.
Yeah, it was nice that Jenna picked up on this. Specifically in this clip from Bill, he's going to be talking about, not just in general how science should be done, but in this case specifically how to define terms and then use them operationally in research. In this case, he's focusing on culture, which traditionally was not necessarily studied in a scientific kind of way. But he made in a different part of that interview, I remember him saying that it was one of those cathartic moments for him when he realized that he needed to turn to culture instead of instead of basically natural selection to explain some of the behaviors he's observing in the group. So in this clip, he talks about defining culture. And at this point, I need to mention that another student of ours, another doctoral candidate, is in the section of social systems evolution, Sojung Han, also chose this clip by Dr. Bill McGrew, and specifically because she was very, intrigued by the idea that you can give different definitions to things, and which she said in her message. Unfortunately, we weren't able to interview her because she's in Leipzig, Germany. But what she said in her message was it's a nice balance between intuition and scientific rigor. In this case, kind of balancing what you need out of your research with what you're going to get.
Right. And Bill McGrew is a professor emeritus at Cambridge University, and he's really well known for doing these broad comparative studies of chimpanzee culture across Africa.
And in the process, emerged as one of the world's authorities on chimpanzee material culture.
That's
so
right.
Here's Bill.
I think there is no consensual definition, and probably never will be, any more than there ever was in sociocultural anthropology for Homo sapiens. And I think that's probably a good thing, because we may well need different definitions for culture for different problems. If I'm tackling culture conceptually, I may need a different definition than if I'm tackling it empirically, where an operational definition is important. But I think there's certain elements that are going to crop up in anybody's definition of culture. Obviously, social learning as opposed to individual learning. Some extent of persistence or endurance, maybe over generations. Some aspect of collectivity, and so on. And standardization. I mean, there are a number of themes that are in everybody's definition of culture. What I've always said about definitions of culture is, I don't care how you define it. Just make it precise, make it operational, make it feasible.
All right, so in our next student selection, we're going to hear from Renata Mendonça. She is a doctoral candidate, also in the section of language and intelligence.
My research interests are mainly related to mother-infant behavior and infant development. I want to know how the hormonal status of the mother and environmental factors influence it. And now I'm studying it on wild orangutans in Borneo. So since I remember, I always wanted to be a biologist or something related with natural sciences and animals. But first, I started to become interested in evolution after I learned about Charles Darwin as a high school student. Later on, I took some classes in ethology and human evolution, and I became interested in both of these topics. And I think primates can be a link between these two areas, because by studying non-human primates' behavior, I can contribute somehow to a better understanding of human evolution. So going back to research, I chose the podcast of Dora Biro in this section because I believe to be a good researcher, it's important to have different perspectives, explore different topics, or work with different species at some point and try to relate them. In the case of Dr. Dora Biro, even if she had worked with two phylogenetically distant animals that are chimpanzees and birds, there's always a benefit and a link. Much of the knowledge she had acquired previously with chimpanzees was very useful for her develop her future work with birds. So for me, what she did and she does is very inspiring because as a researcher, she's flexible and productive at both areas. And therefore, she should be taken as an example, especially for the young researchers.
Okay, so we really need to thank Renata here because it gives us a chance to give a shout out to our friend Dora Biro.
That's right. I've worked with Dora quite a bit on chimpanzee social information use, and in this clip we'll hear her talk about the differences between working with chimpanzees, which she has done here at PRI where she was a postdoc, as well as working with pigeons. So two dramatically different species, and kind of for her, the way that working with both of them has kind of complemented her scientific approach.
Yeah, and so this is another interview that we did at the IAS conference on the evolutionary origins of the human mind. And we can tie this quite well back to the interview with Joseph Call because he's also done a lot of work on different species, and he talks in his interview about how you have to tailor your experimental designs to accommodate the abilities and of different species, and then to be able to interpret your results. And here Dora's going to be talking about the similarities and dissimilarities of working with these two very, very distant animals.
That's right. And Dr. Dora Biro is a lecturer at Oxford University now.
Yeah. Okay, so here's Dora. And by the way, we're going to come back to Dora in the final student selections as well.
Okay.
My PhD was actually on bird navigation, so a very different topic, yes.
Sure.
And in terms of actually doing research, there was a lot from the chimpanzee work that I could apply to the pigeon work in terms of designing experiments and just asking the right questions and thinking of the right manipulation to include in your experiment to answer the question that you're interested in. So in that sense, the two weren't that far apart. I think the real difference was in the animals themselves, the subjects themselves, because chimpanzees are a very, very different type of creature to work with compared to birds. My sort of the main contrast that I felt was that when you work with chimpanzees, you have to basically establish a personal relationship with them. I mean, the way it works at PRI is that the chimps come voluntarily to the experimental rooms, so you have to basically be friends with them. If they don't like you, they won't come. And also, even if they come, they might not want to do your experiment. If they're in a bad mood, or if you've done something nasty to them, or if they have some grudge because last time you didn't give them the right food or something. So you needed to really be aware of this relationship that you had with your subject.
That's right. I mean, you spend so much time negotiating with the chimps.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And with my bird experiments, that was never an issue. So in a sense, it was easier because with the bird navigation experiments, what it basically involved is going into pigeon lofts and picking up pigeons and putting them in boxes and driving them off in cars, and the birds had no say in this.
Right.
If I was skillful enough to catch them, then they were in the experiment. They had no choice. Whereas with the chimps, that was a very different experience for them and for me. But at the same time, I think with the birds, I missed this interpersonal almost relationship with the subjects.
And sadly, that brings us to our final student selection on this podcast series. And that's going to be done by Hoonjin Liu, who's one of our dear friends here at the Primate Research Institute. And he is a doctoral candidate in the section of social systems evolution.
And by the way, we should give a special thanks to Hoonjin because he works on the podcast.
Yeah, he's actually the one who put all of this together, the student selections and editing the clips before he went off to the DR Congo, where he's at now studying the bonobos.
Great. So Thanks, Yunjin, for all the hard work.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Hope to have you back on the podcast in the future.
I'm studying wild bonobo at DR Congo, and my research interest includes female sexuality and their high sociality in the group. So I wonder how can they achieve high social status in male philopatric society compared with female chimpanzee. And to answer this question, I'm focusing on how they manage males as well as females in the group. When I was an undergraduate student, I was thinking about my career in the future. And at the time, I just met Professor Choi in Korea. I made a contact with him, and he gave me a chance to study wild crab. And at the time, I also watched a TV show, and bonobos in the captive condition, they protect dead body. And then I was very surprised because animal can have empathy or sympathy. So I was just so shocked. After that, I just can't escape from that moment, and I just studied about bonobo, and I just decided to be a primatologist. I choose Dora Biro's interview because in her very beginning of interview, she said her history, how she came to Japan. And she just made trial, and she got accepted by Professor Matsuzawa, and she made contact, and then everything was changed. So it was very like me. I just made contact with Professor Choi, and I'm now here. So I was so surprised and impressed by those kind of very initial trial of connection make someone's life totally changed. So I'm loving to hear those kind of moment or history of somebody's and some successful researchers. And I believe this kind of story should be shared by a lot of people because it will motivate young researchers or someone who challenging in their field. So that's why I choose Dora Biros.
Okay, here's Dora again. This time, it's not going to be so much about her science. It's more about her history, how she got involved in the chimp project here in Japan.
Yeah, so it was nice that Hunjin touched upon this kind of a really fundamental thing for young people to think about when they start, getting into research and science, is that it's not always so easy to, not only find topics that you're interested in, but then also put yourself out there and contact people that would be able to facilitate that type of research. And so I guess in some ways, Chris, we probably feel that the PrimateCast could be something that would help, encourage or motivate young researchers to, kind of explore different ideas and different topics through the interviews we've had. And also SciCasp. Mm-hmm. So when Dora first came to Japan, there would have been very little infrastructure for, welcoming international students. And over the years that has kind of grown, and SciCasp, has been a big part of that in the last 5 years or so. So we hope to get more and more people like this coming to PRI as well.
Okay, so here's Dora again.
I first came to Japan in 1996, and that was between my second and third undergraduate years at Oxford. And within the Oxford system, what happens is that during that summer, so between your second and third year, you're supposed to do, you were at the time supposed to do an undergraduate research project, which was basically a free choice. You could do whatever you wanted. You could find a local supervisor and stay in Oxford and do whatever your supervisor told you to do, or you were free to approach basically anybody in the world and try and do an internship somewhere. Mm-hmm. And during that second year of my undergraduate studies, I became very interested in chimpanzees. And so what I did was I wrote to a bunch of chimpanzee researchers around the world, basically saying, I'm interested in your work. Would you mind if I came and worked with you for the summer? Which I think, looking back, was sort of a naive idea perhaps because, it's not that easy to go and work with Jane Goodall, for example. Mm-hmm. But one of the few positive replies that I had came from Professor Matsuzawa. In fact, he was one of the last people to reply, but he replied with a yes, and I was incredibly excited because actually off of my list of people that I contacted, he was the one that I wanted to work with the most. I was really interested in his lab experiments on chimpanzee cognition, and I felt like that's the kind of thing that I want to do. So at the time when I first came there, I really never dreamed that I'd still be coming back to Japan 16 years later, and also I became involved in the wild chimpanzee work that Professor Matsuzawa runs as well, and these were things that I never imagined would happen, but I think it's down to the fact that I enjoyed that first summer so much. It was an incredible learning experience for me. I had never done actual research. When you're an undergraduate, you go from class to class and you basically learn facts and write essays. You don't go into a lab and perform experiments, cognitive experiments with chimpanzees. So for me, it was an incredible experience. I learned not just about chimpanzees, but about how to do research, how to design an experiment, the logistics involved in running experiments, in analyzing data, and so forth. So I think I came originally for a month and a half or something, and then I enjoyed being here so much that I postponed my plane ticket and I stayed as long as I could, basically, before my next semester started. So I think because it was such a positive experience, I spent my third undergraduate year, just dreaming of coming back here and being able to work here again. It's actually true.
And of course, when Dora originally came to Japan, so she came here to work with Professor Matsuzawa specifically on the I project. And that's a project which you, Chris, have also been extensively involved in. So can you just give us, before we get into the clip from Professor Matsuzawa, just give us a brief summary of what that project has done,
Sure.
what it's about.
So the I project, which I've been working on for the last 7 years, is very old. It started in the late 70s, kind of at the same around the same time as a lot of the Ape projects going on in America, which I think have all since stopped. But the I project is still going on, so it's kind of a very special research program. And Dora came to work on it with Professor Matsuzawa in the late 90s. And from the beginning, it's always been a focus on using computer-controlled apparatus to study chimpanzee mind. So that's been the main focus. On a lot of elements of the chimpanzee mind have been studied by Professor Matsuzawa and others. And in this clip, which we'll play shortly, he is going to talk about the reason for that, why he chose to make it an automated approach.
Okay, and so just a final point before we get into this, we really need to send a special thanks out to all of the students who participated here.
Absolutely.
Kind of made this a really special event for us, and we hope to do it again in the future.
Mm-hmm.
And so with that, here is Dr. Tetsuro Matsuzawa.
Here he is.
AI project is featured by computer-controlled automatic experiment from the beginning. That is a clear difference from the sign language study.
Right. And what would you say was the main reason for deciding to be fully automatic?
Objective way.
Mm-hmm.
The science should be objective. So I don't like chattering ape episodes.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to become objective scientists. That is one. And another is I came from human visual information processing and rat brain neuroscience. So the discipline I was trained is more objective, more precise. So so-called psychophysics. So you may manipulate the variables. Then depending variables, the behavior should be clearly described and defined.
Mm-hmm.
So this kind of, how about the relationship of the physical world and psychological world? So this was the original question of me. So that I did not study the topics like language or communication or social interaction. No, I was focusing on color vision, shape perception, and concept of number.
You have been listening to the PrimateCast, a podcast series dedicated to the study and conservation of primates around the world. Brought to you by the Centre for International Collaboration and Advanced Studies in Primatology of the Primate Research Institute of Kyoto University. Visit us online at www.cicaspp.uri.kyoto-u.ac.jp/news/podcasts and follow us on Facebook at www.facebook.com/theprimatecast and on Twitter at theprimatecast.